Well, good afternoon. Happy Memorial Day weekend 2024 almost. We're almost there. Great to get to be with you for SADS Live 142. Love to be with you all out there at SADS Nation, should we call us, or SADS World. I'm Mike Ackerman, genetic cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic and director of Mayo Clinic's Winland Smith Rice Genetic Heart Rhythm Clinic. And our research effort is the Winland Smith Rice Sudden Death Genomics Laboratory. But as we've been together for 4 years now, 4 years with SADS Live, I'm come here on behalf and I give you greetings from Alice Laura, our CEO of the Sudden Arrhythmia Death Syndrome, the SADS Foundation, and her incredible team. Aaron, who makes this happen. Thank you, Aaron. Marcia, the director of our education mission, Anna, Jan, director of development, and the entire team. Genevieve, who's done an incredible job with this upcoming, what's called patient-focused, externally led, patient-focused drug development, EL-PFDD, externally led, patient-focused drug development. Let's say that together. This is going to be huge for us. June 11, mark that date as the inflection point in the history of our families with SADS conditions, specifically long QT syndrome, LQTS, and catecholaminergic polymorphic ventricular tachycardia, CPVT. This will be a day to remember because in it, your voices will be heard. Those with long QT syndrome, your voices that morning. Those with CPVT, your voices that afternoon. And the FDA will be listening. And they will be challenged to, hopefully, we will finally debunk a myth that is perpetuated that says, you all don't need any new therapies. We've got it all figured out. Everybody's happy. And that there's no need for novel therapies for our families. When I listen to your voices, that's not the message that I hear loud and clear. That yes, when we've diagnosed you correctly and risk stratify you and put in your therapy, this tragedy of sudden death does not happen. But you're not satisfied with the status quo. Our therapies are not good enough yet. Yes, sudden death isn't as big of a concern because we are preventing that, but there are complications, side effects, real issues with current therapy, and the FDA needs to hear this loud and clear. Otherwise, there's no reason for industry, their world, to try to spend time, energy, and effort in coming up with novel therapies if there's no unmet need. From what I hear, the need is tremendous. And so it doesn't matter what I hear, the voices of the families need to be heard. And that's an opportunity. And amazing news, because of SADS Nation, we have met the goal. We have an incredible family, anonymous donor, who pledged $50,000 for the ELPFDD if we could match it and raise that amount. And you did it. As of yesterday, we have met the match. We notified the donor. That family is incredibly excited. They said check is in the mail. Well done, SADS family. And so super excited about that. But if you didn't get to be part of that match to say that you made it happen, there's still time. Go to www.stopsads.org. Top right corner, you'll see something that says donate or donate now, and feel free to do so. No money, no mission, more money, more mission. And we clearly know what our mission is at the SADS Foundation. Well, today, 142 is your day of question and answers, and I will do my best to give you answers. And I just, in my verse on my card deck over here for May 24, quite timely, it says, say only what is good and helpful and what will give a blessing. So I'm going to do my absolute best to say what is good and helpful. And I hope you find that to be the case. As I always do, I go to the top And I start there, and sometimes I have to take my glasses off, depending on how long they are. Aaron's giving you the instructions. Only keep them short and easy for me to read. That is the word of the day, pithy, Pithy. Can add that to your vocabulary. And only asking 2 per person max. Used to only be 1, but some of you have been getting your bonuses. And let's see, here we go. Instructions from the team. Let's get this going. Instructions from SADS. The donate button. And here we are. First one, you get it. Do I have any advice for parents of a long QT baby while waiting results of the genetic test? Baby's already on propranolol 3 times a day. Diagnosis following syncope while sick with a virus at 2 months old. Well, yes, I do have some advice, not for this family, but in stories like this, I tell all of my families great news that if we are thinking you have long QT syndrome and we start you on a treatment for your long QT syndrome, whether we know the genetic answer or not, while things are in motion, tragedy on beta blocker therapy is like almost never in our program. 1,800 patients with genetically proven long QT under my watch. And the breakthrough events on beta blocker therapy, and I like propranolol, is almost 0. So I would view that as great news in terms of while you're waiting to get things clarified, certainly not a reason to be fretful, fearful, and anxious. Remember, one of my other favorite life verses, be anxious for nothing. And so try to proceed. And even remember that syncope while sick or syncope fainting while sick with the virus, that doesn't even sound necessarily like it was a true long QT episode. It could be, I don't know enough information, but long QT episodes during the first 2 months of life with from long QT syndrome is really, really quite uncommon. Amanda, and that feels like a new name to SADS Nation. So welcome, and whatever venue, whether you came in through Facebook or whatever mechanism, I see that F. Hello to you. I can't wait to see you also. Now I'm very sorry for the reason. Her mother died from a cardiac arrest, I think arrhythmia. Genetic testing was done post-mortem, and it showed a VUS. And many of you, as part of our program, know that that's that ambiguous genetic test designation where the company says we're not sure whether to call it likely pathogenic or likely benign. We don't know for sure, so we classify those as a variant of uncertain significance. And it happens to be in a gene, I'm assuming, for ARVC. Her heart was healthy but did show fibrosis. My aunt also died at age 42. You have had palpitations in a few episodes. Strength is, then it goes on and it runs out. So I'm not sure. It went so long, Amanda, that I don't see the rest of the question. But I can't wait to meet you. For all of our families with ARVC, arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy, or ACM, which is the overarching term called the arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathies, we hope that you feel that SADS Foundation is your home. We've made it your home starting about 5 years ago now, and we love having the ACM families be under the tent of the SADS Foundation. And in situations like this is where it's so important to look at all of the evidence. What did the postmortem analysis show by the medical examiner? What exactly is that genetic marker? What gene is it in? What strength of evidence did they cite? What is the missing pieces of evidence that is necessary to charge that variant as guilty rather than uncertain, and so forth? So that's the methodical detective work that hopefully any physician who is being gifted with the opportunity to take care of you is doing. It's a rigorous set of exercises. Sam, is there any relation between phenotypic CPVT and bradycardia, or slow heart rate. And there is a relationship. It's not a good enough one to help with the diagnosis, but it is not it is common, it is not uncommon for patients with CPVT, even before they get put on a beta blocker, to have slightly lower or slower heart rates. Not enough slower or lower to be able to be suspicious of that from the 12 lead ECG, because as you know, we cannot make the diagnosis of CPVT from the 12 lead ECG, even though the heart rates are a little slower. It really must be how they display their rhythm on the treadmill stress test. But yes, there is a relationship. Great question. SADS says there's still time to donate, so do it now, but hopefully after you have gotten your 30 minutes worth of good and helpful answers. From Luis, I'm great, thank you. We have already talked, my dad was diagnosed with Brugada after Ajmaline. His genetic test was inconclusive. Although the test mentioned a couple of genes, VUS, what should we, something after this result? That's a really good question. So there's a lot of information out there about Ajmaline. Honestly, there's a lot of confusion. And add to that confusion, there is a paper that just came out. I didn't actually get a chance to read it. I saw a tweet or an X about it this morning, that Ajmaline testing done to normals, healthy people, apparently elicited the positive Ajmaline drug-induced Brugada pattern in 3%. Now, I need to look at that more closely, because I've always been concerned that, like all of our tests, none of our tests are perfect. None of our tests have what is called 100% positive predictive value and 100% negative predictive value, meaning if the test is positive, you have disease, guilty. If the test is negative, you don't have disease, no way. None of our tests, probably there might be one out there, most of our tests are imperfect. And therefore, we always have to wonder, is that test telling us truth when it comes out positive? Could it be misleading us? Could it be a false positive? So whenever I diagnose a family with Brugada syndrome, if the only reason I'm making that diagnosis is because of how they reacted to a drug, Ajmaline in Europe, flecainide is the primary drug we use as the diagnostic drug challenge in the United States, I'm always a little on the skeptical side. I need to look for some corroborating evidence. So, and the genetic variants that you mentioned don't help sort of seal the deal. So detective work continues to be needed in cases like that. Caitlin's asking me, you might be new. I don't recognize that last name, although there's so many now in SADS Nation that if you are new, welcome. And she's asking a great question. Is there mutation-specific risk stratification for the well-known variants that are out there? And hers is a specific one that she's citing called arginine 518X in the LQT1 gene, which is KCNQ1. And what's really I like about that question is in long QT syndrome, we have done, because of now, let's see, 1995, almost 30 years since the first gene was discovered, the ability to do what we call genotype-based risk stratification, in that we know that LQT1 has its story, LQT2, LQT3 has it. So that's genotype-based risk stratification. We are now able to do intragenic-based risk stratification, meaning not all LQT1 mutations behave the same. Some are twitchier than others in terms of the possibility of predicting an LQT1 triggered event. Same is true with LQT2. And because we're now building out the data set and having more and more families with specific mutations like yours, R518X or arginine 518, where we're able to make and discern some mutation-specific risk stratification. And indeed, we do. So that there's a lot known about Caitlin's family's variant. It's one of the most common, if not the most common, in LQT1. We know that if you got a double dose, got it from mom, got it from dad, and you, the child, got both, you have zero KV 7.1 potassium channels in your heart and in your inner ear. And that's why you have bad long QT syndrome and deafness. But if you only have one variant, like most of us with autosomal dominant LQT1, this mutation in isolation, one of them, is actually one of the weaker ones. Weak so much so that it actually lingers in the background rate of the general population higher than what it should for being an LQT1 disease mutation. LQT1 probably affects 1 in 5,000 humans, 1 in 2,000 for all long QT syndrome, 30 to 40% LQT1. So about 1 in 5,000 humans have LQT1. Yet, this specific variant lingers at a frequency higher than what one would predict for that disease rate. In other words, it is a weak variant by itself. That's why it persists in the general population. It actually is a founder mutation, and I'm not sure, again, which Scandinavian country we believe it originated. I always get it wrong between Ireland. Well, Ireland's not really Scandinavian, is it? Norway and Sweden, but it is a founder variant. So we know a lot about yours, Caitlin, and we know a lot about some of the other more frequent ones. And all things considered, I love taking care of families with R518X-LQT1 because pound for pound, I know it's going to be easy for us to treat that. The risk associated with it intrinsically is much lower than some of the other LQT1 mutations. And if that was your first question, that's why I gave you a longer answer. Besides, it was a great question. Sandra, hello. Husband and daughter have Brugada syndrome, 2 Brugada syndrome for today. So our Brugada families are awake and joining us here. I love it. And you were diagnosed 6 years ago. Oh, I'm sorry for the reason. Their son, Daniel, died at age 27. Is there any more information on genetics, as we don't have a genetic mutation found? Yeah, Sandra. Brugada syndrome is really frustrating in a lot of ways in terms of its genetics. We know the genetics for 80 to 90% of long QT syndrome. We can find the cause. So if the genetic test is negative, it actually makes us wonder how good is the rest of the evidence for long QT syndrome. Not true for Brugada syndrome. After 25 years of genetic searching, we only have a solid monogenetic explanation for about 20% of Brugada syndrome. In other words, most patients who truly have Brugada syndrome, most 70, 80%, will actually have a negative genetic test. And that has caused many of us in the field to start to realize that the majority of Brugada syndrome is not even genetic, as in one mutation causing the disease, Brugada syndrome. Some incredible work led by Connie Bazina and others in Amsterdam have put together the so-called polygenic risk score, or for multiple genetic hits that conspire to make you Brugada vulnerable. And that is a genetic risk score that is not yet commercially available as a diagnostic assay to find out, do you have 12 of the 12 risk alleles, or 6 of the 12, or 3 of the 12? And the more you have, the more likely you would be to have Brugada vulnerability. Now you can imagine if it takes many scores or many different genetic hits, that's why often in Brugada syndrome, there's no family history. Many genes have been published as being Brugada causative, 23 genes, in fact. And recently, during this exercise from ClinGen, which is sort of a strength of genetic evidence quality control entity, demoted almost every Brugada gene as saying, not so fast. The evidence is limited to call that an official, no doubt about it, Brugada gene. Lots of work to do in Brugada syndrome, and I, for one, have said for over a decade now that unlike long QT syndrome, which is mostly a monogenetic disorder, one gene, one mutation is the cause for that patient and his or her family. And that's a true statement 80 to 90% of the time. Just not true in Brugada syndrome. Most Brugada syndrome patients have a negative commercial genetic test. Amanda was trying to get at the rest of her question. Is whether exercise is okay. Well, exercise, Amanda, if there's the question of ARVC is controversial, my view on exercise is somewhere between those people who tell our ARVC patients zero exercise, do not get off the couch, walk slowly to the bus. That's wrong. And telling your patients do anything and everything you want with your ARVC. You want to do a marathon, go for it. That's probably wrong. And so we're trying to find that sweet spot that zero dose exercise is not healthy. Extreme dosing of exercise, endurance training sports, marathon, triathlons, long distance cycling is not healthy, specifically if you have PKP2 mediated ARVC, but some level of exercise has to be A-okay. And so many of my patients with ARVC who are athletes, guess what? They're still athletes. They might not be doing the marathon anymore, or they may never have been, but they're still playing baseball, still playing basketball, tennis, weightlifting. And so I can't give you, Amanda, any specific recommendations. I don't give any family recommendations for them. I try to use your excellent questions to illustrate some points. And then a heart symbol, so at least somebody in the ACM land loves that SADS is your home. And Amanda's wondering if I can talk a little bit about the CACNA1C and the different ways it presents. Timothy syndrome versus non-Timothy syndrome, trying to wrap my head around it the best I can. Love your question, Amanda. And if you're confused, we kind of have done that to help make it a bit too confusing. So let me do the best to unpack it I can. So there are specific mutations in the CACNA1C encoded L-type calcium channel. We've talked potassium, we've talked sodium. We haven't talked calcium channels too much, but there's certain mutations in that gene that builds that L-type calcium channel that causes Timothy syndrome. And Timothy syndrome was described by one of my favorite people out there, Catherine Timothy, and her role with the team of Igor Splowski and Mark Keating, and she collected those families that had this constellation of features, multi-system features, not just the heart, but with the heart, QT prolongation was part of it. Congenital heart disease could be part of it. Hypertrophic cardiac hypertrophy could be part of it. But then there's other features, classically syndactyly of the digits and so forth. And in Timothy syndrome, there's a variety of many other things, endocrine issues, susceptibility to infections. The list is a long head to toe list. But there was the very key discovery that there was a hot spot. One missense mutation, G406R, glycine mutated to R, arginine, was a common finding in patients with this head-to-toe multi-organ syndrome called Timothy syndrome. And then there was another hot spot in what's called alternative exon 8A. So there's a cluster of very few number of calcium channel mutations that are responsible for Timothy syndrome. Now, it turns out that G406R, the first one, the major one, was then called Timothy syndrome 1. And then the alternative mutations in the same gene were called Timothy syndrome 2, foul. That was a mistake that persists in the literature because we use LQT1, LQT2, LQT3 to speak to specific genes. And mutations within that specific gene is still LQT1. So it was incorrect when we labeled a different calcium channel mutation as Timothy syndrome subtype 2. So there isn't Timothy syndrome 2 yet. When there's the next gene that is proven to cause Timothy syndrome besides the calcium channel gene, then that gene gets to be called the TS2 genotype. Now, more and more for the new genes, we're not really doing it with the TS1, TS2. In fact, those families with ARVC who have joined the call, they know they haven't read things like I'm ARVC1, ARVC5, ARVC3. Really, the only SADS condition where we use that language is long QT syndrome, and that's because it got classified that way very early on, 30 years ago, LQT1, LQT2, LQT3, and it turns out to be very convenient that LQT1 is the most common. LQT type 2 is second most. LQT type 3 is third place. So that just turned out. But back to Timothy syndrome. So far, one gene implicated clearly as a Timothy syndrome gene, and that's the gene CACNA1C. Now, there's more than one mutation in the Timothy syndrome CACNA1C gene. Then there are other CACNA1C mutations that do not cause Timothy syndrome, head to toe, multi-organ stuff, but only causes QT prolongation, long QT syndrome. And we discovered that in my lab with one of my PhD students, wonderful young woman, Nicole, and that got the placeholder LQT type 8. Now, again, for the uncommon long QT genes, I would rather not call it LQT8 because it turns out LQT7 is wrong, LQT4 is wrong, so we'd have to shift anyway. So I'd rather refer to that version of long QT syndrome as CACNA1C mediated long QT syndrome, parentheses, formerly known as LQT8, because that now we're communicating language to each other. Now there's other calcium channel mutations that doesn't cause Timothy syndrome head to toe, doesn't cause QT prolongation, a long QT interval, but causes or is associated with making the heart muscle, the pump, thicker. That disease is called collectively hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, or HCM. Now, HCM we don't talk about very much in the SADS Foundation because we route those families to their advocacy organization, their home of the HCMA, Hypertrophic Cardiomyopathy Association. So different mutations in that same gene, depending on how that mutation damages the biology of that built calcium channel, can either do multi-organ head-to-toe Timothy syndrome, just QT prolongation, LQT8, just cardiac hypertrophy. And so that's, hopefully that gives you some insight. And it was worth a long discussion because we don't get to talk about it as much. Timothy syndrome, as you know, is like 1 in 2 million people. Long QT syndrome, 1 in 2,000 individuals. And so if it feels like Timothy syndrome gets 1/1000th of the attention, that probably reflects the difference in how common long QT syndrome collectively is compared to how incredibly rare Timothy syndrome is. And my Timothy syndrome kids that I have the blessed privilege to care for, I love taking care of them. But compared to our long QT kids, we don't have very many. It is really rare. And then a recommendation from one of the SADS nations telling, I think maybe Amanda, to stop immediately, not to do excessive sports, especially with your family history. And her advice may be spot on. Again, I think it's important to know what is the evidence and the true strength of evidence. In the literature, the evidence is irrefutable for PKP2 mediated ARVC, meaning the evidence in mice with that gene mutation, with that gene, and in humans is very strong that endurance training sports can act as a disease accelerator, a disease initiator. And so I don't know of anybody who would take a PKP2 family and say, yeah, go ahead, train for the marathon. I don't do that. But on the same token, I also do not tell my PKP2 kids and adults, stop all exercise, don't get off the sofa, walk slowly to the bus. That's also incorrect. So I think maybe the real answer for Amanda and for those out there is to be determined for your risk. What does the profile look in your body? What is the genetic cause? And then what is it that is your oxygen? Some of you have heard me say with my athletes under my watch, if that activity is oxygen to you, then we really try hard to keep oxygen on the table, because you kind of can't live without oxygen. Just like a patient I told yesterday, if it's closer to optional, and he nodded his head, yeah, it's kind of optional. Well, then why do it? If it's optional, then no risk level is worth doing something that's optional. 9 minutes on the counter until Memorial Day weekend officially commences. Hamza from Instagram, and all good, shout out to our Instagrams. How can I get off of, I'm not sure the specific antidepressant that is. Since the time I had gotten shocked by my ICD and it caused trauma, I got shocked 12 times within 20 minutes. I've been diagnosed with CPVT. That's a really good question. So there's a lot there that I can kind of infer. One is, in our CPVT families, as many of us know, in our program, in Arthur Wilda's program in Amsterdam, our program sees more patients with CPVT at Mayo Clinic than any program in the country. We all try very hard to use the ICD as infrequently as possible in CPVT. It's become the last treatment, never the first, never the only. And so I'd have to understand, in somebody who's gotten shocks, why did we get the device in the first place? What else is present as part of the treatment program? And are we winning or losing with the presence of a defibrillator? Now, one of the places where we lose is in this whole area of ICD-related trauma, ICD-related PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's real. Just saw a young man yesterday who the sun is coming out again after really struggling through PTSD, and it's nothing like having the episode, the 12 shocks, be now 12 months, 18 months, 24 months in the rearview mirror, where the hopefulness reemerges. So time is a great healer, isn't it? Now, some of my patients, whether it's that antidepressant that Hamza is referring to or other anxiety medicines and so forth, we use those. We need to be partnering and getting that patient, whoever he or she is, coupled to a great counselor who is well aware of device-related, heart-related PTSD and can be part of that cognitive behavioral therapies and other strategies to try to bring recovery from that just deep anxiety and fearfulness that inevitably could happen enduring a scary situation like Hamza describes. Nick, and I've got good news for you. We're doing a bonus program next week, and that's probably timely since I see the questions still coming in. And 5 minutes, and I'll do my best. I don't want to shortchange these, but I do see a long list that has accumulated. Nick's. Love that name, Nick. That's our number 2 son's name is Nicholas. We call him Nicky. Can you describe the risk stratification of patients with malignant early repolarization patterns on their ECGs, and perhaps how presyncope and NSVT might factor in? Well, I really appreciate the question, Nick. And, I think even though we don't have a lot of families in our SADS nation with early repolarization syndrome or early repolarization pattern, I'm going to put this on an action item to have a program, or at least half of the program, with sort of an early repolarization conversation, if I could do that, because there's a lot to address there. There's the pattern, early repolarization pattern, which is incredibly common in athletes and of no concern. And then there's the pattern that is more concerning for the presence of the syndrome. And then if we think you have the syndrome, how do we risk stratify? And honestly, our risk stratification is easy if we call you the syndrome because you survived cardiac arrest. Then if we think we have found the syndrome incidentally in somebody with no symptoms. So we have lots of work to do. It's not very good, honestly, Nick, but I'm going to task our team to see if I can interview a colleague who will spend half of the program giving their perspective on the advances that have taken place in early repolarization. So hopefully I gave it a little bit, but maybe that was just a teaser for you. Tara's, I'm sorry, Tara, her son died from sudden cardiac death at age 18. It was recommended that he have genetic testing, so they did that. The counselor was vague, and we don't understand the results. Can we help understand the 2 results? One pathogenic variant was identified in one gene, and she gives the letters ALPK3. The other was a pathogenic variant identified in MYH7. What does this mean for him and for my other children? Oh, Tara, I'm so sorry to hear that. Again, not directly yours, but I'll tell you what we do when we get these results. I really work towards comparing the genetic analysis called the molecular autopsy with what the medical examiner, coroner, forensic pathologist said he or she saw when they examined the heart by eye and when they looked at the heart under the microscope. And then if they tell me that they saw features suggestive of disease X, and then the genetic testing says we found a pathogenic variant in a gene where true mutations have been linked to disease X. That detective work really helps in the case. So of the 2 genes that Tara's sharing, the ALPK3, my index of suspicion, I'd have to really see what variant did they report and so forth. But MYH7, that would catch a detective's attention more initially because mutations in that gene, true disease mutations, causes the disease hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And it is the first or second most common cause, is kind of tied for first place with another gene. And so MYH7 mediated HCM is present in about 20% of all HCM families. And so if the medical examiner was telling me the heart looks a little large, the cells look a little big, and I'm seeing some scarring or fibrosis, now I become very concerned or suspicious that MYH7 might be the cause, guilty. And if I concluded that, then the implications as asked for, what does it mean, is when that is found in a deceased person and charged as guilty, then the clinical recommendation is all of that deceased person's relatives, the immediate relatives, the so-called first-degree relatives, meaning the decedent's children, the deceased siblings, and the deceased parents, must have variant specific genetic testing, and any who own the variant then need to be carefully evaluated. And so sorry, Tara, about your son's death. And I do hope that what I offered there was, as it said, as I started, Ephesians 4:29, say only what is good and helpful and what will give a blessing. I hope I did. I certainly tried to do my best today to achieve that. And I hope it was. And so we'll start with Allie. When we go to questions, you get the first one. So Aaron and team, mark hers. That will start it next week. But next week, May 31st, bonus, SADS Live number 143, first part, an interview conversation that I'm going to have on the state of gene therapy with my former trainee and dear colleague, Dr. Andrew Landstrom at Duke, as we have been in and will be wrapping up Gene Therapy Month. Exciting things happening in the space of gene therapy, but caution, exciting doesn't mean here tomorrow. We got a lot of work to do, but it's exciting, and I can't wait for that interview. First half, and then starting the question second half with Allie. Also, next month, we are entering in CPR AED Awareness Month, and specifically, June 1 through 7, we have hashtag for Sarah, to remember Sarah, to try to make a difference for her memory and her story, to have more AEDs in the public square, so that if somebody has a sudden collapse, goes into cardiac arrest, is heading to sudden cardiac death, we could intercept that and rescue that with rapid rescue of the chain of survival, including the AED. More to follow. Hashtag for Sarah. Well, I'm off for the rest of Memorial Day weekend to see her, Juniper, and the rest of my family. So look forward to being with you again in 1 week. Until then, have a wonderful and safe Memorial Day weekend 2024. Bye now.